And our next speaker is Meyers, Head of Intelligence, CrowdStrike. Please give a big warm. Specifically, I like the platform. I work with the platform. Adam, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I was here last year and had a great experience. And so I'm going to update you this year on some of the trends and things that we've seen from a CrowdStrike perspective in the threat landscape. For those that weren't here last year, I'll briefly touch on the threats that we track and why. When we launched CrowdStrike almost 12 years ago, we had this mantra that you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And by focusing on the adversaries, you can better learn how to defend against them if you understand their tactics, techniques, and procedures. And we started off talking about attribution, and were quickly met with people saying, you shouldn't do attribution, that's the government's job. And so we kind of began talking more about motivation. And so there's 3 motivations that we track. Nation state, who engage in sabotage, espionage, disruptive and destructive attacks. And in the case of North Korea, also revenue generation. Financially motivated e-criminals who are looking to generate revenue for themselves. And then hacktivist, activist, nationalist, and terrorist groups. And so as we look at the threat landscape over the last year, there's over 200 groups that we track at CrowdStrike. We have a cryptonym system that we use to track these threats. Criminal groups we track as Spider. So the ransomware actors and botnet operators are generally tracked under that Spider nomenclature. China we track as Panda. Iran as Kitten, North Korea as Chilima, Russia as Bear, India and Pakistan as Tiger and Leopard respectively, and hacktivist, activist, nationalist, and terrorist we track as Jackal. You can see criminal, hacktivist, and the big 4 nation states up here, but this problem has proliferated. We've seen more and more threat actors enter the fray out of South Korea, which we track as Crane, Vietnam, which we track as Buffalo, Turkey, which we track as Wolf, Syria, which we track as Hawk, and Colombia, which we track as Ocelot. In the last year, we added 33 new threat actors that we track, countless threat groups, and lots of other individual threat actors that we track. Over 200 threat actors is quite a few and should make everybody very nervous. You have to defend, if you're on the blue team side, against all of these threats. But the good news is that they're not all created equal. They have different capabilities, things that they can do, different intentions, things that they want to do. And so you can map this and generate kind of the big things that you need to be worried about. And so from a general global perspective, there's kind of the big 4. When we look at threats to Israel, you can see a much more reduced set of different threat actors. You can see that we see criminal groups, China, obviously, Iran will be a big one, some actors out of North Korea, Russia, and activist groups as well. So much smaller threat landscape that if you use threat intelligence, you can now figure out which threat actors you need to prioritize your defenses. You also need to look by business vertical. So different business verticals have different threat actors that target them. Now, when we think about all these threat actors, we have this concept we call breakout time, how long it takes for these threat actors to move laterally, to escalate privilege, to get deeper into the network. Every year we compute this time, and in 2022, that time was 84 minutes. That's down from 98 minutes. So in the last year, the threat actors got 14 minutes faster, and one of the questions I like to ask customers and people that I talk to is, Did you get 14 minutes faster at stopping these threats? And frequently the answer is no. We also have seen identity has become a huge problem. In the last year, since June of last year, something like 80% of the incidents that we've identified have had an identity component to it. Identities were captured, they were stolen, they were social engineered, and then they were used to log in as a legitimate user to the organization. And those threat actors, additionally, rather than deploying malware or deploying tools that might be detected by EDR technology, they chose to live off the land. They chose to use the tools that were already present on the operating system. And you can see that this trend goes up every year as well. The threat actors are getting smarter, they're getting faster, and in the last year, 71% chose not to bring any malware when they conducted the intrusion because they knew that would be alerting and easy to find. One of the big trends that we've been calling out and that we observed is that ransomware has been moving to data extortion. The calculus of ransomware is really predicated on creating enough downtime to maximize the impact so that an organization will pay quickly and pay more. With data extortion, these threat actors steal the data, they don't encrypt it. And they've figured out that because of things like GDPR and various privacy acts across the globe, that there's a financial cost that the companies that are being victimized are dealing with when they lose that data. And so rather than creating enough downtime to make it cheaper to pay to get your data back, now they quote things like GDPR and they demonstrate that there's a massive regulatory compliance and legal impact from losing that data. And that's where they generate the need to pay them. It's also easier for them. They don't need to deal with ransomware, they don't need to deal with cryptography, and they just steal the data. The other issue and why these threat actors are increasingly moving, in fact, 20% of the ransomware threat actors that we track at CrowdStrike stopped using ransomware. They're just doing data extortion. The other reason that they're doing this is that we've gotten very effective at dealing with ransomware from a playbook perspective. When you think about that crisis slide that he showed earlier and the war room, organizations have figured out that when you get a ransom demand, you say, oh, I'm not authorized, or I don't know what Bitcoin is. And you kind of create enough of a long period of time where you can grind that threat actor down on price, and you kind of hope that they make a mistake, and you waste their time. That's the ransomware playbook. It's not unlike how a bank robbery goes down in a movie. The problem with this with data extortion is it doesn't work. When you say, I don't know what Bitcoin is, or I'm not authorized, the threat actor comes back and says, we're gonna leak 10 gigs of your sensitive data. Let's see if you figure it out. So what we've done as an industry is we've created this dynamic of trust but verify. Just slap MFA on it and we'll have better security. But the problem is that we've kind of created this trust but verify model. We need to flip it around. We need to say verify, then trust. So one of the key things that you'll be hearing about over the next year or more is more and more organizations moving to identity protection, employing identity protection. The EDR and the technology there, I was going to say antivirus, but it's pretty dead, so we'll just stick to EDR. The EDRs protect the enterprise, they protect the systems, but now we have to move forward and protect also the identities, the user accounts, and this is a different model and it requires different technology. The other trend that we saw over the last year is that threats to the cloud have increased radically. If you asked me a year ago what the big threats to the cloud are, I would have told you coin miners. But what we're seeing now is that exploitation is occurring in the cloud, 95% increase over the last year, And the number of threat actors that are what we call cloud capable or cloud conscious has increased radically as well. 288% threat actors are now comfortable operating in the cloud. They can live in that space between things like Azure and on-prem enterprise Active Directory. They use the cloud for persistence. They're able to then pivot back into the enterprise. Groups like Scattered Spider, which we've been tracking, hitting organizations all over the globe with what starts off as basically phishing. So what a lot of people might think is, well, the cloud is a problem, the cloud is insecure. The cloud is secure out of the box. The problem is when we start to change it and modify it, we introduce all of these misconfigurations or vulnerabilities. And so we need to really start to think about employing things like CSPM, cloud workload protection, and cloud native application platform protection in order to protect these cloud environments. The third thing I want to talk about is, and I have a whole minute left here, the third thing I want to talk about is the vulnerability landscape. What we've seen over the last year is that threat actors are rediscovering the same vulnerability in many different products. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers Log4j. There was some 3,600 products that we know about that had Log4j that were vulnerable. The threat actors have figured out how to use Java gadgets and ways to kind of trigger that vulnerability in products that people didn't know were vulnerable. They're also not accepting patches as being the end of a vulnerability. So if you take a look at something like proxy logon, and then proxy not shell, and then the auto discovery, it's the same vulnerability. They just figured out different ways to instantiate it or to trigger it. And then the other thing I want to touch on is in the last year, we all are aware of what happened in Russia and Ukraine. And while the world was so focused on what was happening in Russia and Ukraine, and I could talk about the various attacks that we saw, the wipers and the disruptive attacks, but what nobody was paying attention to was the fact that China was quietly collecting data in every geographic region, every business vertical, and sucking that up and bringing it back for driving the Belt and Road Initiative, the Made in China 2025 initiative, the 14th five-year plan. It's endemic and something that everybody needs to be aware of, especially when you look around in Tel Aviv, where there is Chinese companies that are tied to the government in Shanghai building the metro, building the port, building the port up in Haifa. And so I think I'm going to get the hook here pretty quick. But what I was going to say real quick also, generative AI is the thing that everybody asks a lot about. And in the 10 seconds before they get the hook out, I'll say that we've seen that there's utility for using generative AI from a threat intelligence perspective to summarize very complex topics. And in this picture, you'll also see adding MITRE ATT&CK framework things to it. You can use it to generate code. Here's a Python snippet I had it write for me to pull IOCs out of email. And you can use it to even generate rules like Yara signatures or Snort signatures to aid in the detection and protection against various threats. Threat actors, I think the last point here is that I hear from people that say, well, how can threat actors use this to write new code, write new malware? The reality is, I think it's more likely that they'll use it for phishing attacks, particularly if they're not adept at that particular language. And I'll show you just in closing that I asked ChatGPT to write a Python script to talk to ChatGPT, which you would think it's good at, but this is an example of these hallucinations that you'll hear about, which is it made up a library that didn't exist and told me that that's what I should be using to interface with ChatGPT. It took me a while to figure out that that library wasn't real. And so I don't think that the threats are quite there yet where they need to be. So I see a flashing red sign, so I won't go through my 5 points of things that I tell people, but I see a lot of cameras out. Take those pictures, and I'll yield my time to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.